Hey, Heather, how are you?
I'm still doing dishes, so I'm keeping my
I get it. Efficient.
yeah.
Oh, are you still muted, Heather? Let me see. Let me try to unmute you. Can you unmute, Heather?
Can you hear me now?
Uh-huh.
Okay, hi. Is anyone else joining us?
Well, we hope so. We hope so. We'll see. I know a number of people reached out asking if they could sign up, and I just said there wasn't a sign up, just for them to log on if they wanted to come. So we'll give them.
Oh, okay, great.
And then
It's such a great idea. Yeah.
thank you. I think it's going to be beneficial to me, and
Me too.
the dual benefit of being community bonding for us, and then also engaging us in the curriculum that our kids are being exposed to, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we got 4 of us.
Good start.
Heather, have you met my husband, Aaron?
Yeah, I think at one of your birthday parties. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too, Heather. Thanks for coming tonight.
Yeah.
Tina is on as well, but she's washing dishes, so she'll join us.
There's somebody else.
Parsons.
Hi.
Why are we missing?
Who's Miss?
I'm on.
Who's
I am on my. I'm on my supervisor's Zoom account right now. I just realized I'm not on my own Zoom account, but here we are.
I thought maybe it was a musical pun. Valerie and Matthew, do you know Heather Petchis?
I think we've met.
Yeah, we've
Yes.
met.
I know the name.
So
Nice to see you guys.
And you've met my husband, Aaron.
Yes, at the Sensei party, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you guys too. I'm so glad you guys are doing this. This is such a good idea to get people to connect. And
yeah, well, thanks for participating. It's only as good as everybody joining in, right?
It's gonna be awesome. You guys are gonna love it.
Yeah. I've never read this book before, so I'm excited.
Yay!
Yeah.
Be fun. It'll be adventure.
Odyssey is great.
It'll be nice and pressure-free since we're doing it
Right.
over that amount of time. So that'll be good.
Yeah.
yeah, I read it in high school, so it's been a minute.
Awesome.
And I can commit to audiobook right now.
That's awesome. We did, was it the Aeneid we did audiobook, Aaron?
Yeah.
About 6 months ago.
Just a couple months ago.
It's designed to be oral tradition, so that's a great way to do it, actually.
Yeah, if you don't do audiobook, you really should read it out loud. Get the poetry of it.
Nice.
All right.
Well, should we give folks a few more minutes before we
maybe just till 7:35, and then we can get started, because it'll be recorded. So that way we'll make it available if anybody wants to at least listen to the content ahead of time, before they read it. They can kind of hear what we discussed, and then that way we'll stick on a schedule.
Great.
So Matthew, have you read it before?
I have not.
Geez, this is gonna be fun.
First time for everything.
That's right. So good. I've had a number of parents say that their kids in the logic school are coming home talking about different texts, and they're like, "Oh, that's great. I wish I could talk to you about it, but I have no idea." So this will hopefully be good for family engagement too, down the road as our kids get to that stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, all those books we know we should have read at one point, but never got around to, or our high
Yeah.
school skipped over that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So Pastor Morsh was hoping to get on, but he didn't know if he was going to be able to make it or not, if they were kind of up in the air. So we were going to have him open in prayer. So instead, I won't put you on the spot, Gina. So I'll just go ahead and start us off in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for gathering us together as a school family to immerse ourselves in this great narrative of human history and to connect us with those who've gone before us, to learn from them, to see how it impacts our world today. We ask that you open our minds and increase our understanding, increase our wisdom as we struggle to continue to grow and to continue to learn, even into adulthood for many years to come. May this also be a point of connection for our community, growing us closer together, an enrichment for our families that allows us to engage more deeply with our children as they learn and grow at the Geneva School. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Aaron, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so maybe we could start off with just quick introductions. I think most of us know one another, but it looks like we had somebody else just jump on. Who's there? I see the name Isabel on the screen. But
Yes, I am Alejandro Kentuckian. She's driving, but
Oh, hi, Alejandro.
okay.
Hey, glad you could join us. You can listen in.
welcome. It's good to have you here.
Okay, so be quiet. Okay.
Okay. So I'm Aaron Cariotti. I'm Jennifer's husband, and as some of you probably know, we have 3 boys at Geneva, an 8th grader, 5th grader, and 3rd grader. So Jennifer and I thought it would be a great idea if the parents got exposed to the same literature curriculum content that the students are getting exposed to at Geneva. And the first reason is these are awesome books. I mean, they're just really great. And you'll have a better, more enriched human life if you've read them. So they're also a lot of fun. And I think some people wonder, why would we bother reading old books, books that are 2,000 plus years old. In this case, the book is about 2,700 years old. So what does a book like that have to say to us today, right? So that's maybe one of the obstacles people sometimes encounter when they think about reading the quote unquote classics. And maybe another obstacle people encounter is the assumption that reading something that is that old or something that's considered to be one of the classics is going to be really difficult, right? The language is going to be inaccessible, or the story is going to be too complicated, or the world that it describes is going to be so different from our own that it won't seem relevant, and I won't know what's going on, and therefore I won't enjoy it. And I think the best way to overcome some of these ideas or prejudices is just to dive in and read some of these books. And it's true that initially some of the language in the books or the concepts in the books can seem a little bit foreign, but typically after a few minutes of reading, you're going to settle into these stories and get to know the characters and become very engaged in them. And before long, you're going to realize, yes, this is a terrific story, it's a terrific book. It speaks to very human themes that are universal and that are consistent across the ages, and that in some ways haven't really changed in the last 2,700 years. So it's a really kind of extraordinary experience once you overcome some of those initial prejudices or obstacles or assumptions that I'm not going to get it or I'm not going to like it. When you actually read these things, you see how fun there are, and then it becomes clear why they've endured for so long. So I think the first reason to read the classics is this is by sifting across time. This is widely considered to be some of the best of what has been thought and said about human life, what it means to be a human being, what it means to live in society, all these questions that are, I think, important for all of us and for our families, for our children. The second reason I think that it's important to read a book like this, and when we're talking about Homer, we're talking about really the first great work of literature in the West. So this is the guy that started it all. This is the guy that set the tone for Western life, for Western literature, for Western philosophy, for thinking in the Western world about what it means to be a human being, what it means to live in society, questions about justice and how to live a good life were put forward by lots of different people and lots of different stories. But the most compelling stories came from Homer, and they became the most influential stories, which means they shaped our culture in many ways and continue to do so. The language that Homer uses, or the ideas or the characters that he puts forward, became part of the language that people used in Western society to understand themselves. And up until actually fairly recently, there were ordinary phrases that most English speakers were familiar with that, if you trace them back, went all the way back to Homer. So I hear it less commonly these days, but a generation or two ago, if people described being stuck between a Scylla and Charybdis, it was more or less like saying being stuck between a rock and a hard place. And if you said that, everyone knew what you were talking about. And what you were talking about is an episode that occurs in the book where Odysseus and his men have to navigate between two really, really dangerous things, like a big old monster on one side and a whirlpool that's going to sort of swallow them up on the other side. So the fact that 2,700 years later, in many different languages, including English, this image has been used to communicate something shows just kind of how important a book like this became for our culture. And what happens with a book like this, or a book like the Bible, or the plays of Shakespeare, is that these works are part of an ongoing conversation, right? So we start off reading Homer, and then we read Virgil, and then we read Dante, and then Shakespeare, and then Jane Austen. And what we realize is that all of these people were familiar with those that went before, and we're learning from them and responding to them and referring to them in their works. And as we get to know these works, we become part of that conversation, right? That's gone down through Western history and down through the ages and down through kind of the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we share. Stories are very important for human beings. Myths about where we came from and where we are going have always been important for human beings. So one of the ways that we understand ourselves, and one of the key ways that we pass on to our children an understanding of themselves, is we tell them stories. We tell them stories about our family. We tell them stories about where they came from and what things were like when they were really young before they can remember, and what things were like for their parents and their grandparents when we were young. And we tell them stories about our country, right? Stories about the founding, or how this thing came to be. It's part of our lives now. And we tell them stories about the big questions of human life. We tell them the story of Adam and Eve, or the story of Christ's death on the cross, to explain where we came from and why there's evil in the world, and the fact that we've been redeemed by God And all of this points to the answer to the question that every human being is wrestling with, which is, who am I, right? And so I think there's value in reading these books, yes, so that we can talk to our children about what they're learning in literature, and we can engage with them in terms of what they're learning at Geneva. But there's also a reason that Geneva teaches these works and not just, contemporary literature that happened to be published sometime in the last 10 years, even if there's interesting books and good stories from that collection of literature as well. So we want to be part of that conversation down through the ages. We want to understand who we are, not just in light of the stories that our parents told us, but the stories that Western culture has told through the ages. And again, those stories begin with where we're going to begin, which is this blind bard, this blind singing poet named Homer, who composed these two very, very long epics. Some people believe that he actually had them memorized, which is rather astonishing. If you've ordered the book and taken a look at how long it is, 24 books or 24 chapters that took about an hour each to sing, to recite. But as someone who was a master of the oral tradition of the time, he had committed these stories to memory. And he had taken stories that were in the culture and put them together in an incredibly beautiful long poem that's very powerful and very engaging and very interesting. And we're going to start actually with chronologically the second of the two stories. So today, no one's done any reading. So Jennifer and I thought we would just give you a little bit of background sort of on what to expect with the book club, maybe a little bit of background on what to expect with this book, so that you can dive in and be a little bit oriented and have a good sense of kind of what to expect and where you're going.
I want to add too, we begin at Geneva, they start with the Odyssey as opposed to the Iliad, because of its ability just to be even a little more engaging to the students. The Iliad has to do with battle, but the Odyssey has more monsters, and so it's a great one to grip the kids' attention right out of the gate. And then when they go back and read the Iliad, they already kind of know certain characters in the story. So it's kind of now going back to see, oh, what happened before this? So I just wanted to interject that.
Let me give you just a little bit of advice on, there's lots of different translations out there of the Odyssey. The one that I recommend, because it's one that the kids read at school, and I've read a couple of translations, and this one is definitely my favorite, is the translation by Robert Fagles, Fagles. So the same edition that your kids may have brought home if they've read this already. The audio book using this particular translation is really terrific. It's read by the British actor Ian McKellen, who is the guy who played Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, if you've seen the Lord of the Rings movie. So very well done audio book with a great reader. And one way to kind of get into this book, if you're not used to reading epic poetry, is to listen to the audiobook while you read the text. Maybe you're in the car while you're listening to it, so you can't do both. But keep in mind that this book is based on an oral tradition, which means it was meant to be read out loud. Now, granted, we're reading an English translation of the original Greek, but nevertheless, the translator tries to maintain some of the kind of poetic cadence of the original. So to hear it read out loud is a very helpful way to kind of enter into the story in the way that it would have been heard and experienced by the people of the time when it was written and when it was performed regularly. Feigel's translation, use the audiobook if it's useful, or read it out loud. It sounds kind of strange reading out loud to yourself. But again, maybe just doing a few lines at least in each of the chapters or a couple of pages read out loud can help you slow down and hear the cadence of what's going on. And one of the things you'll notice when you read the Odyssey is here and there's these little phrases that tend to get repeated many times throughout the text. Sometimes they're a title of a character, like Homer will mention the character of Odysseus, and Odysseus will have a little tagline, or Hector will have a little tagline. Hector, breaker of horses, for example, would be one of those little fill-in phrases. And one of the things that you're seeing going on there is that because this was an oral tradition, and each line in the Greek had a certain number of syllables and a certain cadence, these repetitive phrases were used so that a person could fill in the rest of the line. If I need 5 more syllables, I can insert this stock phrase and kind of fill in that line and then go on to the next line. So the book is a poem. Don't let that spook you or scare you away. And it's a poem that has a little bit of repetition to it, and that comes out of the oral tradition in which it was originally written. The other thing, besides just that background of what the Odyssey is, that would be helpful to know is a little bit about the other epic poem that Homer wrote, which is called the Iliad, which Jennifer mentioned, and some of the other traditions around the events in this book that everyone at the time knew, because there were other epic poems at the time that described and recounted those. So very, very broadly, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the other stories that we no longer have because they've been lost, had to do with the events of the Trojan War. Okay, so we're talking about things that happened either during the Trojan War, that was the Iliad, or in the years following the Trojan War as a result of the war, that's the Odyssey. So what's the backstory on the Trojan War? And some of you may be familiar with a little bit about the Trojan War from history or from literature courses or whatever. But the Trojan War was a war between the Greeks, sometimes in this book called the Achaeans, and the people of the city of Troy, which is a powerful walled city that we know now to have been an actual historical place. That 20 years ago, people weren't sure, but now we have definite archaeological evidence that the city of Troy existed. It was a real place, and there probably was a real war historically that was something like the Trojan War that we read about in these epic stories. So the story goes that the Trojan War began with it was started by King Menelaus, who had a very beautiful wife named Helen. Got a visit. He was the king of the Greeks, and he got a visit from a Trojan prince named Paris. And Paris and Helen fell in love. Paris made off with Helen. They eloped back to the city of Troy, and they hid behind the walls of Troy. And as you can imagine, this did not make the king of the Greeks very happy that this Trojan prince came and stole his wife from him. So Paris was young, he was dashing. Menelaus was a bit older, maybe not the most handsome guy, even though he was the king. So Menelaus rounds up his men, all the various Greeks and Greek city-states that were loyal to him, including Odysseus, who is king of a small island called Ithaca. And they go off and they fight the Trojan War. And the war lasts a very long time. So the Greeks are camped out on the beach. They sail all these ships over to Troy. They camp out on the beach, and they're there for years. The war lasts like 10 years. And they're attacking Troy, and there's a lot of back and forth, and there's bloodshed, but they can't breach the walls of this fortified city. The Iliad is an event, recounts events in the Trojan War right before Troy falls, right before the city falls. Basically, the Iliad is about a guy named Achilles, who you've probably heard of, the greatest warrior of all time, who's mad at Menelaus because Menelaus stole one of his women. So you see that, there's a lot of stealing of women in these days. So Menelaus takes one of his women. So Achilles is angry and he refuses to fight. He just sits on his ship and he sulks until the greatest Trojan warrior named Hector kills his cousin. Then Achilles gets really mad. He goes on a rampage. He kills a bunch of people and starts basically turning the war in favor of the Greeks. And that's the story that you have in the Iliad, is the story of Achilles' rage after his beloved cousin is killed by Hector. And then Achilles slays Hector, which is the greatest warrior, the great defender of Troy. He's a prince. He's a son of the Trojan king. And then the story ends not long after Hector dies. What happens after that is recounted in some other stories. And what happens after that includes the famous fall of Troy. And there's kind of a backstory that we'll read about in the Odyssey, where we learn about how Troy falls, but it has to do with the famous incident of the Trojan horse, right? Where all these warriors hide inside this big wooden horse, which they present as a gift to the Trojans. The Trojans are fooled by this. They bring the horse inside the city. They believe that the Greeks are packing up and sailing away. They actually sail some of their ships away, sort of feigning that they're leaving. But they have a dozen or so of their best warriors hidden inside this horse. And once they're inside the walls of the city and everyone's asleep, then it's easy to bring the place down. They run around, they slay, all the best fighters that are defending the city in their sleep. They set fire to the place and they burn it to the ground. And it's a disastrous defeat for Troy. So it's this major catastrophe that happens. All this is happening before the Odyssey even begins, but helpful to know the backstory because it'll come into our story at various points. Okay. The other thing that happens in the Iliad that plays a role in the Odyssey. Achilles eventually dies. Achilles is killed by Paris. His weakness is famously his heel. He gets shot by an arrow in his heel. That's where we get the term Achilles heel. And that brings him down, and then he's slain. And his armor is awarded to Odysseus. So Odysseus is sort of considered the greatest of the Greek warriors after Achilles, right? So we already know this man is a big deal. He's the king of this island, Ithaca. He's considered to be the second greatest warrior, probably not for his prowess on the battlefield. He's very good with a sword. He's very good with a bow and arrow. He's very good at all that stuff. But he uses his wits, and he's really clever, and he's excellent at strategy, right? So Achilles had kind of the brawn, and he could run around just kicking everyone's butt, basically. But Odysseus he had some of that, but he was also really clever. In fact, the Trojan horse scheme was Odysseus's idea, right? So, and we'll see that coming up again in the Odyssey, that he has to use his wits. He has to outsmart some of his enemies and some of the people that are getting in the way. In addition to being able to fight, he's got to be really clever. So that's one aspect of his character that we see already in the Iliad. But another thing that happens that sort of sets the stage for the Odyssey, for all the stuff that's going to go down in the Odyssey, is that the Greeks, after they sack the city of Troy, commit some really horrible atrocities. And the other thing that we have to remember about the Iliad and the Odyssey and these great epic poems is that people were trying to make sense about what it means to be a human being, and they were also trying to make sense about big questions about the gods, about justice, about fate, about, when we do terrible things, does that come back to bite us? Does that come back to haunt us? How does all of that work? How do we account for the things that happen in the world that seem beyond human control? So all of those questions are the ancient Greeks are wrestling with in these stories. Well, one of the things that happens after the sack of Troy is that the Greeks do some very bad things. So Achilles' son kills the king of the Trojans. King Priam is his name. He's the father of Hector who was slain by Odysseus. And he kills him when Priam basically flees to the altar of one of the gods. I'm forgetting which one it was, but it was the main god of the city of Troy. And he puts his hands on the altar. And that was, in that culture, supposed to be a sign of protection, right? So there were rules in war, right, about what you can and can't do. And one of the rules is if somebody's fleeing to a temple and seeking refuge there under the patronage of that god, you shouldn't kill them, right? They've already surrendered and you need to spare their life. But Achilles' son kills King Priam anyways. Not a good idea. Second thing that happens is that Hector, who's the prince, the son of Priam, there's a beautiful scene in the Iliad, which has a lot of fighting in it, but it's a very moving scene where he kisses his wife and his little baby goodbye, and he goes out to fight for what's going to be his last battle with Achilles, and you pretty much know he's going to die. And he's a very noble man, and he's got a beautiful wife and a beautiful little baby son. Well, this little infant, when they sack the city of Troy, one of the Greek warriors takes the infant and kills him by throwing him from the walls of the city. Totally unnecessary kind of atrocity that's committed as they're burning the city down. The last thing that happens to the royal family at the hands of the Greeks is that another Greek warrior rapes Priam's daughter, rapes the princess, the daughter of the king. Her name is Cassandra. And he rapes her in the temple of the goddess Athena. So rape is bad in this culture, obviously. And raping someone inside a temple of the goddess Athena is a major sacrilege. Okay, so the Greeks are not without fault. There's atrocities on both sides, but definitely the stuff that went down after they sacked the city of Troy was bad. And the remaining Trojans obviously don't like it. And the gods some of the gods are particularly offended. So what does this have to do with the Odyssey? Well, what is the Odyssey about? The Odyssey is about Odysseus's attempt to journey home after the Trojan War. That's the Odyssey. That's the story. And Odysseus meets all kinds of obstacles as he's trying to make his way home. Okay, so just to give you a basic framework of what to expect with this book, it's about this guy, great warrior of the Greeks, really clever, good fighter. He's got a bunch of men with him at the beginning of the story, and he's trying to journey home, but he's having a really difficult time getting home. One of the reasons he's having a difficult time getting home is that some of the gods who were offended by these outrages are kind of taking revenge on some of the Greeks as the Greeks are coming home. Some bad things have already happened to the other Greeks when we begin our story and we see Odysseus struggling to get home. Again, these are from oral tradition. These are not things that have been preserved in a lot of the stories that we still have. But the king of the Greeks, whose name is Agamemnon, he comes home to find that his wife, because he's been gone for 10 years, has taken up with another man, and they're not too happy about the king arriving home. So his adulterous wife and her lover end up killing Agamemnon, right? So He goes off, he fights, helps Menelaus get his woman back, Helen. He gets home, and then he gets killed. Part of the revenge taken by the gods on the Greeks because of the atrocities they committed at the end of the war. And there are other issues that some of the other Greeks encounter going home. And Odysseus is sort of caught up in this. He wants to get home to his family. He's married, he's got a wife. His wife's name is Penelope. He's got a son. His son's name is Telemachus. And he's already been struggling for 10 years to get home by the time the Odyssey starts. So 20 years away from home. His son was just a little boy when he left, and he's now about 20 years old, and doesn't know his father, and was a baby when his father left, so doesn't have any memory of his father, doesn't even know what he looks like. And his wife is struggling to remain faithful while many men are courting her, telling her, why are you still waiting for your husband to come home? He's probably dead. All the other Greeks have either made it home or they've been killed, and we know they died. Nobody's heard any word from this guy in 20 years. Just accept that he's gone and marry one of us. Now, why do they want to marry his wife? Remember, he was the king of this little island. So if you marry Penelope, you become king. You're going to be the man in charge. There's going to be money associated with that. There's going to be power associated with that. So she's got all these men that are vying for position, the suitors, trying to woo her into another marriage. And she doesn't know if her husband is alive or dead. She doesn't know if her son's ever going to see his father again. She doesn't know how long she should hold out before she gives in and bites the bullet and gets married again. So there's problems at home with his family, and there's problems with Odysseus because he's already been struggling for 10 years to get home when our story begins. Okay, so that's kind of the backstory. Questions so far about the Trojan War, about the characters that I described, or about kind of what's going on right when we open the book on page 1 of the Odyssey. All right. Two types of epics in the ancient world. One of them was an epic about the general theme of which would have been eternal glory. And for the Greeks, eternal glory meant glory in battle and being remembered by others for my great exploits in war. Okay, so that's what the Iliad is. The Iliad is, how does Achilles achieve immortality? By being the greatest warrior ever and being remembered in song and in poetry and so forth. The second type of epic in the ancient world was the homecoming epic, right? The epic about the man struggling to make his way back to home and hearth and be reunited with his family, right? So you have one type of epic you imagine might involve war, and another one that might involve peace. But with the homecoming epics, there's still a lot going on. There's a lot of adventure. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of obstacles to overcome before I get home. And that's basically the story that we're going to encounter in the Odyssey. Okay, for next month, we're hoping that we can get through books 1 through 8. And again, by book, we mean chapter. The books are referred to as books because in the original Iliad, each chapter is about the length of what you could fit on a parchment. And it would take about an hour to sing this poetry out loud, for the bard to sing this poetry out loud when it was performed. For us, these chapters will probably take about 30 minutes to read. So we're talking about 4 hours of reading, or probably about 4 hours on the audiobook. So hopefully doable. But one thing you'll notice when you start reading books 1 through 8 is that Odysseus doesn't even show up until book 5. And book 1 through 4 is all about what's going on at home with his wife and with his son. Okay, so keep that in mind when you start reading. Like, this book is called the Odyssey. It's supposed to be about this guy Odysseus and his journey home. I've read 3 chapters already, and where's Odysseus? Okay, so book 1 through 4 is about his son Telemachus and his wife Penelope at home, waiting for him to come home, struggling with what's going on at home, wondering if he's going to make it home, and sort of wondering what to do, right? So setting the stage for where he's trying to get back to and what's happening over there. And then in book 5, we meet Odysseus. And in book 5, Odysseus is stuck. And he's in a bit of a bind. He's stuck on the island of a goddess named Calypso, who's fallen in love with him and doesn't want him to leave her island. Bit of a tricky situation. So he's going to need some help figuring out how he can extricate himself from this female goddess and get back to trying to journey home. And it's a bit of a tricky situation because she's quite powerful and there's a risk of offending her, right? If she says, Odysseus, am I not the most beautiful creature you've ever seen? And don't you just want to stay on my island here and enjoy pleasure and bliss forever with me? Wouldn't it be wonderful? You know, for him to say, well, no, actually, I'd prefer to get home to my wife, even though she's immortal and she's not a goddess. And, you know, it's been fun, but actually, I prefer to be there rather than here. Kind of a sticky situation for him to navigate. So book 5 is going to tell us how he manages to make his way off that island without upsetting Calypso too much. And then books 6, 7, and 8 are kind of the first couple of next steps on his journey home, and some of the people he encounters and some of the adventures that he has. Okay, so that's sort of in broad outlines what to expect with the first third of the book that we want to talk about next month. Jennifer, did you want to mention anything about maybe some questions that would be good for folks to think about or to kind of keep in mind as they're reading, maybe potential discussion questions for next time, or themes that crop up in the first third of the book?
Yes, so we kind of had 3 questions that we came up with. There's many more things we can discuss at our next meeting, but 3 larger scope questions that you can think about while you're reading. So the first one would be, why does Homer begin the Odyssey where he does, kind of in the middle of the story? And why does he begin with the son Telemachus rather than starting off with Odysseus himself? So, you know, some people would say, oh, it makes it more confusing. Other people say, no, it has a great literary impact. So that's something you can think about. The other thing to pay attention to is this, there's a Greek word called xenia. It's Xenia. And in our language, it would almost have 5 different elements to it. So it would be, it's more broadly, you can think of it as a general term for hospitality, but xenia itself meant if you were a guest of someone, if you were the host of someone, if you were a stranger traveling on a road, if you were a foreigner, and if after your stay you also become a friend. So this word encompassed all of those elements of hospitality. So we don't really have one word to encompass it, but it's a big thematic theme within Greek culture. And the gods were involved in this. In fact, Zeus himself, I think, was kind of the god of Xenia. like of this idea of hospitality. So you think of travelers on a road. Now, if we're traveling somewhere and we can't make it to our destination, we stay in a hotel. Well, they didn't have hotels back there. So where would somebody stop if they wanted to go get a meal or needed lodging? So the story that Aaron shared about Paris being a guest in the home of King Menelaus and then running off with his wife was a huge sacrilege against this Greek understanding of hospitality in Xenia, because you had obligations to somebody who hosted you, and your host has obligations to you, to a traveler, to making them feel welcome in a foreign land. And so there's a lot of things that come as a result of basically abuses against Xenia. And then in the beginning, you'll see Telemachus be both on the receiving end of that, with all these suitors misusing his hospitality in his kingdom while he's trying to hold it for his mom. And then he actually journeys and goes and stays with several of the other Greek kings and is a recipient of very good hospitality. So just kind of pay attention to that as you read through books 1 through 8. And then another thing to think of, we also would have probably some Christian ideas surrounding this, but this was a pre-Christian society. But we do see very clearly what are the effects of Odysseus's absence, both for his family and for the greater society of Ithaca. So Ithaca has been without a king, and Telemachus has been without a father for now almost 10 years at the beginning of this story. So the Trojan War had been going on for about 10 years, and then it takes Odysseus a very long time to journey home. So almost another 10 years. So to be without a father for 20 years. And then if you also think of all these young men who are suitors for his mother, Penelope, all of their fathers would have gone off with Odysseus to fight in the battle. So they all have been without fathers. And how has that affected and shaped the whole running of Ithaca society? And how has it shaped these young suitors' idea of what their rights or how they are to act within their Greek culture? So in general, so those were the 3 main questions. Why does Homer begin where he does? What are the effects of Odysseus's absence on his family and society, or the absence of fathers in general? And then pay attention to the idea of hospitality. Then there's 2 other things. We don't want to overwhelm you. It's enough to just listen to on audiobook the stories and read them yourself. If somebody wants to dig deeper, there's a lot of great resources out there. One is there's a company called the Teaching Company, or the Great Courses, and usually they have professors who are like some of the most top-notch in their field, and you can listen. They have one on the Odyssey that you can listen to that's also on Audible. So if you want to do some more digging, you can. There's also Hillsdale Colleges has a podcast in which their president, Larry Arnn, usually is going through the great books tradition that they'd use at their university. And they begin with Homer's epics, because as Aaron mentioned, this is kind of like the beginning of Western civilization literature. So there's a couple podcasts on Homer, but one specifically on the Odyssey. So those are 2 ideas that you can look into. And then I already mentioned why we start with the Odyssey at Geneva. Does that was there anything else you could think of, Aaron, in terms of the questions? I also wanted to point out we had, so Jason Miller, who is on here. Jason, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and your background that might be really interesting to share with everyone if people did not read it in the chat?
So I'm an archaeologist. And I've worked in Greece, a couple different seasons, also all over California. But in this particular case, I worked at Mycenae for 1 summer, and teaching archaeology to students. And we excavated what they call the lower town. Mycenae is divided into districts. So you have the Citadel, which is what people have traditionally thought of as Mycenae. But then all around the bottom of the town, there was this huge city. We used to think that they couldn't support the population, but it turns out there were two very large dams right next to the city that supported the population that Homer said that it supported until an 8.6 earthquake struck towards the end of the Bronze Age. So I can talk about that. I can show some of the pictures from the site. I can also talk about Troy, both the later Roman period Troy, which is mostly what you see on the surface, as well as the earlier Bronze Age period Troy. And then the archaeology of the actual city of Troy itself, because what we used to think was the city was actually just the citadel. The actual city was substantially larger than what we used to think. So, and that's happened in the last 10 years.
That would be amazing. I definitely, Jason, I would love to hear all about that, and if you have pictures or anything like that to share,
Sure.
that would be amazing. Where is it? So, Troy would be in modern day what?
Turkey.
Turkey?
Yeah. Okay, so it's just on the coast of Turkey. I mean, the Heinrich Schliemann found the right spot. The trouble was what he thought was the city was actually just the citadel.
Mm-hmm.
And so the actual city, well, we've started doing ground penetrating radar and magnetometry and a bunch of other different remote sensing techniques. And it turns out that the city, it spreads for like a mile all the way around that, particularly on the coastal side. And of course, sea levels have changed a little bit. So that complicates things. And then, of course, ravages of time. It makes it very hard to see anything. And of course, the Europeans were the ones that got into archaeology in that area first, and they care about the temples, and they care about the palaces, and they really don't care about how ordinary folks live.
Mm-hmm.
Or they've only recently started caring about that sort of thing. And so, not a lot of attention was paid to it until the Americans and the Turks decided to get involved. And, we started doing these large-scale sweeps of the surrounding area, because the description that Homer has of this huge city doesn't match just the citadel of Troy. It's a very tiny little place. It's not that big. And of course, when Schliemann cut right through the middle of it with his giant trenches, he disturbed several different layers dating to the Roman period and the later Hellenistic period, and he just sliced right through the middle of all of it. And of course, the notes are substandard. I mean, some days they're good, but when somebody comes and visits and he gets into the schnapps, well, they're kind of terrible. So it's interesting. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years about these cities. And it's through the work of local archaeologists and also the American School for Classical Studies. So
that's
one of the things
very cool.
Oh, sorry, Aaron. I was going to say one of the things Jason mentioned is that he can recite part of the poem in Homeric ancient Greek. So I don't know if maybe next month, if you wouldn't mind, Jason, maybe coming prepared to, I don't know, is it like the prologue or the very beginning part? Maybe you want to, or pick a section.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be really great.
Okay.
One of the interesting things is Aaron mentioned that the Iliad is more of like a war. It's one of these two type of epics. And what does it begin with? The very first word is rage, right? Or wrath. Homer is very good. Yeah. So Homer is telling you a little bit what his story is going to be about. And he does the same thing in the Odyssey. And he refers to the man, meaning even though we don't see Odysseus until book 5. He refers to him, and that whole prologue beginning section is really about Odysseus himself. So yeah, if
The
you wouldn't
man of
mind, that
many
would be
twists
amazing.
and turns. Yeah, that would be amazing. That'd be really cool.
Sure.
So Troy would have been just across from the Aegean Sea from Athens in Greece. And there's actually a couple of helpful maps sort of showing the journey of in the Odyssey in most of the editions of the books. So it's a journey. It has to do with actual places, some of which have mythical creatures and strange things that happen there. But the geography seems to be more or less sound. So it can be helpful in terms of following the story to kind of keep track of where they are and where they've been and where they're going on those maps.
All right.
Does anyone
Well-
have any questions so far that we can address, or no?
Are you guys all excited to read this? Or is it intimidating? Is it someone has to say something. Come
Just
on, Courtney,
be thankful
turn
you
off your
don't have to
microphone.
translate it from the original Greek into English.
So, Jason, when you do that Greek translation, do you mind wearing a toga?
That's awesome.
We can pour out some libations like they did in the ancient
Yeah, maybe
world.
have enough alcohol. Bust out the ouzo.
I ran across, I'd seen it before, but I ran across a great quote just the other day there's a French poet I like named Charles Péguy. He was a poet and an essayist, died in World War I. And he once said, "Homer is still new this morning, and nothing perhaps is as old as today's newspaper." And I like that quote because I think when you start reading this, you see, okay, it's very fresh, it's very alive, it's very vivid, it's very human, kind of the emotions and the conflicts and the struggles that people are having in this story, even though there's fantastic elements and the Greek gods and strange creatures and monsters and so forth. But the human beings are very human, they're very relatable, and the stories are very timeless. Whereas, the stuff that we tend to consume a lot of, are obsolete by next week, right? There's a lot of kind of throwaway reading in our life of emails and articles, and it's not that stuff's not worth reading, but it's just it doesn't endure very long. I mean, if you were sitting and reading, nobody reads a newspaper anymore, but if you were reading a news story and I told you, oh no, that story is 3 months old, you'd probably stop reading it and throw it away. Like, that's old news. It doesn't really apply anymore. It's kind of obsolete. But great literature doesn't work that way. It's still new every morning, and it's a lot of fun to read. And, in my own experience, sometimes I have all these great books that I've always been wanting to get around to. Sometimes it takes a book club to motivate me to actually do it, because the urgent things tend to crowd out the important things. So maybe this book club is an opportunity to kind of like prioritize some of these things that that are good for us and good for us to kind of dive into, but maybe on our own we wouldn't be as motivated to buckle down and do it with so many urgent things pressing on us in family life and fires to put out and so forth. So hopefully it can be a little bit of that for all of us as well.
Yeah, just a point of business too is I should have let you all know ahead of time right at the beginning. I don't know if it indicates when you log in, but I did record this. So hopefully if you don't mind maybe sending me a thumbs up, if you don't mind, if there's another parent, if there's other families at Geneva who weren't able to participate but would like to, are you okay? Is everybody okay with me sharing just this link, this private link? Thank you. I appreciate it. And if you're not, you can let me know individually. But did we cover everything? I think we did good. We got in an hour. We gave ourselves an hour and a half just in case. I think maybe once we read all the material. So books 1 through 8 will hopefully have more discussion that we're able to have, and everybody contributing, because we'll have questions for everyone. But this was kind of a background, so you kind of know some things going in. Does anyone have any comments or questions?
Just thank you, Curiosities, for doing this.
Oh, thank you for being
You're welcome.
here. We're grateful.
Of course.
All right.
It's gonna be
we'll just
fun.
close in.
Invite your
It is going to
friends.
be.
We're excited.
That's right.
Hey, Jen and Aaron, can my dad and grandpa do this? A Geneva grandpa?
I don't see
Participate.
that.
I'm totally fine. By default, he's Geneva family, right?
Right? Yes. Okay.
If you want to invite your third cousin once removed, you know, it's all good.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for
Well,
the
look forward to
overview.
seeing all of you next month, and happy reading.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. You
Have a
guys have a
good
good night. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.
Thank you,
Say
Heather.
good
Bye,
night.
y'all.
Goodbye, Magnolia. Good night.
Brendan, do you want to say goodbye? Brendan. Want to say bye?
Bye, Mrs. and Mr. Teriyaki.
Oh,
Bye,
here.
Brendan.
And
Bye,
then-
Lauren. And there's Magnolia.
Bye, Mr. Parsons and Mrs. Parsons.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Brendan. Good night.
Bye. Sweet dreams.
Good night, guys. Thank you.
All right.
night.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.